So John, when did you first become interested in aviation?
I became interested as a very small boy. My father was in the Royal Air Force and National Service. He couldn't fly because he was colourblind, but he was always interested in flying, and he had lots of books in the house, and we used to get taken to RAF Lookers to the air show there. We went there every year, and there was always aircraft flying around, and it just fascinated me. So from a young age I was always keen to fly. In fact, bizarrely, I bumped into a chap from school who I hadn't seen since I was about 10, and when I said what I did, he said, "Well, but you're always interested in aviation." And even that age, I thought, "Well, crikey, maybe I was." But yes, so it's from a very young age, so I've been very fortunate to be able to do it.
Yeah. So what year did you join the RAF, and could you tell us some of the aircraft you trained on?
Yes, I joined the Royal Air Force in 1984. I managed to get my Special Flying Award through the cadets, which I wasn't a member of, but there was a few scholarships were given out, and when I was at school I managed to get my PPL, and I flew the Cessna 152 up at Dundee in Easter holidays, and I was there for about 3 weeks and got my PPL, and then joined the Air Force when I was 19, as I said, in 1984. Went to RAF Cranwell, and from there went to RAF Church Fenton on the Jet Provost Mark III JP, which was great fun. A marvellous course, hard work. You had to work hard and play hard, and the JP was quite hard work to fly. I think the phrase was a constant noise, variable thrust, or variable thrust, constant noise, one or t'other. But whichever way it was quite hard to fly, and I think that was part of the plan. Was that it did kind of whittle people down through the course. The Church Fenton was brilliant. It was a year's course from learning how to fly to going solo, and I went solo at RAF Elvington, which was a great place to go solo because it has a massive runway, so you could always see it when you're downwind, which is quite nice. And the weather was lovely. It was in the summer, and we would sit there with our flight reference cards, learning the checks, and watching and hearing the skylarks above us as we then whizzed around the little jet provosts. So there was 10 of us on the course, and so you learnt how to fly the aircraft around circuits, and then doing aerobatics, and then instrument flying, and then low level, medium level flying, and I did 100 hours on the jet provost. And halfway through, we had to put down what you wanted to fly when you got to out of the training system, and you volunteered for, or you asked for either Group 1, Group 2 or Group 3, so that was fast jets, multi-engines or helicopters. I had always wanted to fly helicopters, but I kept that quiet because the Air Force really wanted fast jet chaps, and rightly so. But there was other aircraft that needed seats and needed pilots to fly them, and so I've put down Group 3, which is helicopters, and the squadron boss wasn't too impressed and invited me in for an interview to say, what do you want to fly helicopters for? And he said, "It's not the easy option, you know." I said, no, it's not so, absolutely. Fortunately for me, there were slots, and myself and this other chap went to RAF Shawbury. It was about a year-and-a-half course at Shawbury, and we learnt how to fly the aircraft around the circuit, went into the hover. And the first time you went into the hover, it was quite interesting because I remember the instructor you'd get into the hover, and the instructor would give you, the cyclic to keep the aircraft in one space, and so you'd look forward and right and forward and right. And once you got that, he would then take that off you, and then he would give you the collective, which keeps you go up and down. And so he'd let you do that so you could get the height of the aircraft above the ground just right, and then he'd give you the rudder pedals so you could move around left and right, and then he would give you all 3 controls, and then off you went all over the air trying to hover this thing, and eventually it clicked like everything. Eventually it does click, and I think the first solo in a helicopter was probably more nerve-wracking than first solos in the Cessna or the Jet Provost, just because it was just so different. So we learnt how to operate the helicopter from sloping ground to confined areas where you're dropping into areas in a wood and to sneak your way in there amongst all the trees, and then low-level flying, which in a helicopter is fairly low, and down to normally 100 feet we're authorised to whiz around at. And the Gazelle was great because it could go up to 160 odd knots, and so could whiz along. And so at 100 feet, it was great fun. And as the course progressed, you then did some formation flying, close formation and tactical formation. After the Gazelle, you then you chose what you wanted to fly, and I was quite keen to fly the Wessex in Northern Ireland, but there were no slots. So I then did another course on the Gazelle, which was an advanced low-flying, tactical flying course, and we went off in formation, and you had about an hour or 2 hours to plan this hour or 2 hour sortie for this real-time on target pickup of theoretical troops, and you had to be there plus or minus 30 seconds. So it was quite hard work, and you had to brief this and go off in formation, but it was great fun, very satisfying. By the end of this month's course, it was called clicking into place, which was lovely. But the Puma that I was going to fly, they needed more people in Northern Ireland on 72 Squadron, and so I then went to 72 as I'd wanted to do in the first place. So that was in 1986. Went to Northern Ireland, and you went out as a fresh young thing. I was 21 when I went out to 72 Squadron, and I was the second youngest on the squadron with this other chap called John Tapper, who's a lovely fellow, and he and I were the young puppies on the squadron, and we were flying officers. So we were one of the lowest ranks out there, but we were tasked to operate around the province, and from supporting the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the British forces, who were at various bases all over the province.
So would you fly on a regular basis out in Northern Ireland?
Yes, you worked 3 or 4 days on, and maybe had a day off, and then another 3 or 4 days on, and then you had a numbers of days off, maybe 3 or 4. When your usual routine was going to the squadron, say 8 o'clock or so for morning briefing, and then you would know your tasking that day, because you'd either do tasking around RAF Aldergrove, where we were based, or you'd have a set task down in South Armagh, down at Bessbrook, which is an old mill, and you could get there were 2 Wessex down there each day, and a Lynx and a Gazelle. And so when you got down to South Armagh, you were given this tasking sheet. Out it would have times and pickup points and numbers of people that you had to pick up and drop off. And so your day would run like that, and you could be flying for, I think one day I did about almost 10 hours flying. And if it was really busy, you do some night flying, but it just depended on the situation. And you're then on standby at night in the officers' mess, effectively down there. But it was a used mill, so the army had made the best of it, and it was fairly comfortable. But you were fairly safe in there, although it did get mortared a number of times, not when I was there. But there was a few marks, potholes around the place. You went to a place called Dungannon, which is halfway just over the Loch Ness, or Omagh, or across to Enniskillen. And they all had kind of codes and numbers on them. And you would, again, you'd just be given these tasks by the army. Or down in South Armagh, you would fly to the various observation posts, one called Fork Hill, and another one, or the RUC places, Royal Ulster Constabulary places, and one called Cross of Glen, which was an interesting one, which was quite a hotbed of the IRA, and used to fly into this small camp, army RUC camp, and it only had enough room just for the Wessex to squeeze in. So it was quite a tight squeeze, but again you had to go in there quickly because you didn't want to hang about. In fact, there's a story of a Wessex, which before they built the fence around the RUC area there, they landed in the field just outside, and the IRA were waiting, and they fired a RPG-7 at the Wessex, and the door was open, fortunately, the crewman, and he saw this missile coming towards him, and he fell on the floor, and because they'd fired the RPG so close, it went straight through the door, out the other side of the Wessex, and then went skidding along along the grass. Luckily it didn't go off, so the boys went, "We're out of here," ka-ching, and disappeared. Not when I was here, it was before I pitched up. So yes, the usual day was you'd be tasked by the army, and you worked 3 or 4 days in a row, and then you managed to get home quite a lot, or you just stayed in the officers' mess if you were single, or if you were married, you're in the married quarters, and you're all behind the wire. So it's very sociable. I must say. In the officers' mess, it was there was a lot going on, which was great.
So overall, did you enjoy your time on the Wessex?
Yes, yes. It was, I think, most people's first tour in the military. They have a soft spot for that aircraft because you're learning your trade. You're learning, you've been taught to fly, and now you're actually putting all those skills to good use. So it was great fun, I must admit. And it's 2 years, and in the 2 years, I just almost managed 1,000 hours, which was the aim. Everyone wanted to get 1,000 hours, and I was just underneath that. But it was great fun, and the squadron, 72 Squadron, was marvellous because we were all lived together. One of the few times where you all lived at one place, and all the chaps were, you know, all very sociable, I must say. So it was great fun, I must say. I would do it again if I could. My favourite tour, and the Wessex was very forgiving. You could get away with quite a lot. It had a lot of power, which is quite nice.
So John, in 1988 you were offered an exchange posting. Could you tell us about this?
Yes, I still wanted to go Pumas, and so that was my next choice. And then I was offered this naval exchange tour to 846 Squadron down at Yeovilton, flying the Mark IV Sea King, and they were called the Junglies. They're called the Junglies because they operated in Borneo in the Malayan crisis, and they obviously got very good at it, and so they were called the Junglies. Now, I hadn't really heard of this tour, apart from there was one chap in the squadron who was a Navy exchange guy. He was a Jungly, so he was telling me all about what the Sea King, Mark IV Sea King did, and another chap had done it, and the squadron boss had also done this Jungly tour. And I thought, well, that could be quite good. And then the sweetener was, I was a flying officer at the time, and so they said, well, but to go to the Navy, you've got to be a flight lieutenant. I went, all right, then I'll go. So promotion, being a Scotsman, happy with that. So went down to Yeovilton, and where the squadron, they were based. There was two squadrons, 845 Squadron and 846, and went there initially, and then off down to Culross to do the ground school. And there was a simulator there for the Sea King also, did a wee bit of simulator work. Then up to Yeovilton onto 707 Squadron and learned to fly the Mark IV Sea King, which was bigger than the Wessex, or is bigger than the Wessex. We could, in the Wessex, you could take 12 troops with all their kit. In the Mark IV Sea King, you could take 28. The Mark IV Sea King doesn't have a radar or all that kit, so in the back it's just like a Wessex really. So, but you can get lots of people in there and all their stuff, and it had a longer range. You could fly for up to 6 hours if you filled the tanks, and it had more instruments. The Wessex only had an ADF, and it also had Decca, so pretty basic navigation. Whereas the Mark IV Sea King, it was fully airways equipped actually. We had VOR, we had ILS, we had Tactical Air Navigation System, TANS, which did use a combination of Decca and maybe VOR, I'm not quite sure on that one. I'm sure somebody will pick me up on that. So you had a lot of kit. And the 846 Squadron and 845 were fairly well advanced with their night vision goggle work. So we did a lot of night vision work, flying around low level. And our primary role with the Junglies was to support the Royal Marines wherever they went in the world. And each winter we would go up to northern Norway. You'd either fly up to Bardufoss in the back of Hercules, which we did, and the squadron was already there, or some of the aircraft were there, because there was a permanent winter base effectively for the Junglies. And you learnt Arctic warfare flying, and you did an Arctic survival course, which was obviously cold, but great fun. And the Royal Marines taught you how to ski, to do cross-country skiing, because every time you went flying, you always carried a full Bergen full of kit, and your skis, these big long wooden skis, as they were called, Pusser's planks, which are very long things, and I was rubbish at it, but I thought flying was better than skiing. And we operated day and night, supporting the Marines and lifting their big 105 guns around the ranges, and landing in snow up in the glaciers and all over the place. And landing in snow was a challenge, because you would get this thing, as you came into the hover, obviously all the snow would billow up around you, and you'd have the thing called whiteout. So you had to do a type of approach and landing called a 0-0 landing. So you'd effectively come in low level, and then the last couple of 100 feet or 100 feet or so, you would start to slow down, and you'd aim to land at 0 height and 0 speed, called a 0-0. And the theory behind that was that you kept the snow cloud behind the cockpit as long as possible, so that you could still have visual references. When you landed, you always had to have some form of visual reference, be it a small tiny tree or anything really that would stay there when you came into land. But when you picked up the troops in the middle of nowhere, they would have this procedure where they would pile all their kit and the men bar one into a big kind of melee of kit, and then the one man would be volunteered to march so many paces forward, and he would have to stay there. As you came into land, you would put your right boot by your right foot as you're coming into land right next to this chap, because you knew that if you landed right next to him and you were into wind, then the door was right next to the rest of the boys, and they were just lobbing all the kit, so they didn't have to travel anywhere. And because it was so cold, we had heaters on the Sea King, but you never switched them on, because the Marines didn't want to have all their kit defrosted and get wet, and because you're normally positioning them somewhere else. And so we were all bumpled up with big gloves and big boots to fly around as well as they were, but we couldn't put the heaters on, so we just accepted we were cold.
So how did their training differ compared to the RAF?
Well, it was pretty standard really. You did the ground school first, and that was about 2 weeks with exams throughout, and then off onto to the squadron, or to the training squadron. But it was all very similar. You were the novelty, being the RAF chap there, and so there was lots of banter, and you had to give as good as you got. But it was very similar, and equally as professional. The junglies, they had more roles to do. I mean, they flew the Royal Marines, so that's your usual trooping. We were also embarked on ships around the world, so you had the ship operations, and we seemed to do more in the early days, more night vision, low level, be it in formation or just by yourself. But the formation was always interesting, because with an NVG you could, when you're close enough and you're doing a low level whizzing around, and you get too close, you can see the instruments, not read them, but you can see the glow of them. Yeah. And it allowed, night vision work was a great way of low flying, because it was safe. It meant that you could see everything apart from wires. You could see all the trees, the objects, and so you could whiz around at 100 feet quite comfortably. When you saw wires, you had to plan how you're going to get over them, and it was a pylon. You headed towards the pylon, and then you pulled up, because the pylons are normally about 250 feet. You were at 100 feet, and then you would do a wing over effectively over the pylon, and then carry on low level. But for night vision work, you always one of you was always navigating, and the other one was flying, because it was a lot more to do. And the night vision hovering, you effectively had these 2 toilet tubes in front of you. You were looking through, so you had this one which would then coalesce into one hole, one kind of circle, and to sit in the hover, you had to keep your head moving continually to actually get references to hover with. So it was quite a challenge, but again, like anything, the more you do it, the more kind of natural it becomes.
So what were some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Sea King?
I think the strengths were, especially in the jungly world, was the number of troops you could carry, and the range you could go. The landing on and off a ship it was designed for landing on and off a ship. So the jungly Sea King, the Mark IV, had fixed undercarriage, so you could easily crash it onto a deck, as I often did, and it was fine, and you had a good amount of power, so you could carry a lot, and you had a long range. It also had the boat-shaped hull, which was a design advantage of the Sea King. And if you ever see one, then you can see the boat shape just under the nose, and it allowed you, if need be, to land on water. If you had a single engine failure in the hover and above a certain weight, you were committed to landing in the water. And you used to practice in the simulator. We didn't do it for real, but you had this way of getting away if you could. If the other engine was still working and it wasn't too rough, you could do a thing called a single engine water takeoff, a shuto, I think it was called. And we used to do it in the simulator. And you'd over rev the head and you'd start trundling along. And the brief was wait till the bow wave comes up onto the windscreen, and then you pull in all the collective you've got and let the NR drop to this minimum level, and you'd then whiz along as low as you could, 5 feet, 10 feet above the water. And then you did this bizarre thing, whereas normally on your low level, very low, if you lower the collective, you're going to go down. But because we had to take the pitch off the blades, you lowered the collective and the disc got faster, and they give you more lift.
Okay.
Indeed, it is a bit the wrong way round, but it did work. I never had to do it in anger, but you used to do it in the simulator, and so we all knew this technique of single engine water takeoff, and that was one of the advantages of the Sea King. If you landed a Wessex in the water, you're going over.
Yeah. So when you were flying in Europe, did you ever work with any other nations?
We worked with the Dutch. We had an exercise near Arnhem, and I think Deelen was the airfield we were at, and we operated with them. That was, I think, the only main time. And the Norwegians, obviously up in northern Norway, we operated with them. But it was mainly the Royal Marines or the British forces, depending on the exercises that we were doing.
So do you have any stories that stick out in your mind from your flying over there?
With the Navy, my time really, I enjoyed my time in Norway. We used to obviously go up and operate up near the place called Jørken, a big gunnery range. And so I did occasionally I did one time where I then came into the hover and lost the references. And the only way to get out of that is just to look at the artificial horizon and just pull as much as you can, of not over torque the aircraft, and you'd pop out the top of this snow cloud and then catch your breath and go around and do it better next time. But landing on and off ship, no, not really. The odd time where during the Gulf War, Desert Storm, the build up to it, we were a bit short on fuel and we had to land on one wheel on a frigate because the winch broke, and so we couldn't get the hose on. So the only way to do it, luckily it was calm enough, we just put one wheel on and we refueled that way.
So can you tell us a bit about like living on board? What was it like?
You had a set routine. You were when you were effectively on duty, you would go to morning. The Navy called it shareholders, not briefing. Morning briefing. I went to morning shareholders, and you're told about the weather, and then whatever tasking was required. You may, if you always had secondary duties, and with the Navy, I was the squadron nuclear, biological and chemical warfare officer, so there was bits and bobs to do with that, be it on a ship or when we went ashore. So you always had some secondary duties, but I didn't have any ship-related secondary duties because I was only the token crab. So I didn't do any ship-related duties apart from just flying the airplane or operating with the squadron as required. So you do day flying and night flying. Speaking to any Navy helicopter pilot, night flying from a ship is always fascinating because you're in the middle of nowhere and it's black as anything, and you get airborne from the ship. And once you get going, you're flying into blackness. So generally, Navy helicopter pilots' instrument flying was very good because it had to be, because you're sitting on this deck 30-40 feet above the sea, and you lift into the hover and you wouldn't hang about because you obviously didn't want to hit the ship and the ship was going up and down, so you'd move, say, left, and at the same time you put in a boot of rudder and pitch the nose down and transition forward. But you kept an beady eye on your radar altimeter, your radalt, because that and your speed was giving you life. You knew that as long as the radalt was going up and you're accelerating, you're fine. But initially you were doing an instrument flying circuit effectively, and then you come round and back towards the ship. And so night flying over the sea was low level, was certainly sharpened up your instrument flying skills.
So did you enjoy your time on the Sea King at this point in time?
Yes, I did. Yes, it was great, and it was lovely to do something different and working with the Navy, because we went to places that the Air Force didn't go, on and off ships, doing dawn assaults with the Royal Marines, a big formation of Sea Kings, attacking a beach and dropping in the Marines, was a great adventure, big formations. And then once you put the Marines ashore, we would then go and live in the field with them. They would go forward and we'd have a forward operating base, and we'd live in a tent with our engineers, and your aircraft would be nearby, it'd be dispersed. And then you'd have your tasking every day, and you'd go off and pick up the chaps and move them around. But you were an independent unit as a 846 squadron and 845. So it was different from the way the Royal Air Force operated, because most of the SH boys were in Germany, and they had a different way of doing it. Whereas the junglies were quite independent, and once they went ashore, then they were on their own. And you were just one big unit doing as required by the Royal Marines. Yes, so I was given the secondary duty on the squadron of being the Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Warfare Defence Officer, the NBCDO, which was not the most exciting task, in the respect that at the end of every exercise there was always the NBCD phase, and so you pitched up and made the boys put on their gas masks, or the respirators as we like to call them, and we operated for a day or so in NBC conditions, which is a bit more challenging to work in, all your kit that you had to wear. And I did a course at Portendown, the chemical establishment, for 2 weeks with all these Army fellows. And that was quite eye-opening. So I came back to the squadron, and so at the end of every exercise, that was my role, and to make sure the squadron could operate in a chemical or nuclear conditions effectively.
So then you got sent to the Gulf before it actually started. Could you tell us about this? Yes,
I got married in 21st of July, I must get that right, 1990, and we were on honeymoon in Thailand. And we came back from this lovely island to Bangkok and put on the TV for the first time in a couple of weeks, and I saw on the news tanks rolling into Kuwait City, and I thought, this doesn't look good. Literally got back from a few days later back home, and the answer machine at home was full of messages saying, "Red, where are you? Red Adair, you get into the squadron, we're going on another holiday." And literally we had a week or so to get all our kit, and we embarked on RFA Fort Grange and headed out to the Gulf. And as the squadron NBC officer, I had to get all this kit organised, extra bits and bobs to be sent. A lot of it was sent down to Gibraltar, and we picked it up there because we had to leave so quickly. So this was a flight of 846 squadron, and we sailed out down to Gib through the Suez Canal and around the Yemen and into the Straits of Hormuz. And our role was HDS, helicopter delivery system, effectively, and we supported the frigates who were operating at the top of the Gulf up near Kuwait, and we were flying up and down long-range sorties to them, as well as doing some low-level flying over the desert to get used to that, just in case things got more interesting. So I was out there from beginning of September until December, beginning of December, and then we were relieved by B flight of 846 Squadron. And we were flying around in this lovely weather, hot, but very hot, and operating with your AR5, as it was called, which is your pilot's gas mask, effectively, was quite challenging, and you could only fly for so long when it was 30 odd degrees in a helicopter without any air conditioning. It was quite a challenge, I must say. But on the way out, we were fitted with these sand filters onto the Mark IV Sea King. The ones you see now have these boxes on front of the engines, and these sand filters, effectively, when you got into the hover in the desert, then these helped to get rid of most of the sand from going into the turbines of the engine. And when we had these fitted, we weren't briefed at the time, or maybe I didn't read it, but we believe we weren't briefed that when you were in heavy rain, to make sure you switched on the sand filters. But we were just flying over the sea, so we didn't have them switched on to actually protect the engines from sand, and it effectively sucked out the sand before it went into any sand before it went into the engines. We sat over the hover of this ship in this heavy rain shower, and then we transitioned forward, and suddenly there was this bang, and one of the engines failed, and unbeknown to me, is because water had built up in this box at the front and had gone down one of the engines. Fortunately not both, but went down one of the engines and effectively put the fire out. And so we were down to one engine. But the Sea King was fine. We weren't too heavy, and we just carried on to a place called Ras Al Khaimah, which is north of Dubai, and did a running landing and landed there. And then the engineers came out and fired it up, and it was all fine. So basically you just threw in a bucket of water down the engine. But we got a night stop in a hotel, so we just made the best of it.
Yeah.
But again, the Sea King on one engine was fine. We trained for it, but it certainly caught your attention when you had to hear a bang in a helicopter. But every helicopter pilot is trained that if you hear a bang or anything, the first thing you do is slightly lower the collective, just in case you lost both engines, because you've got to get the pitch off the blades quickly to allow you to keep your head speed so you can then auto-rotate. So that was the first thing that instinctively happened. You'd lower the collector just a wee bit and check in to see what actually did happen. But managed to get away with that, which is quite nice.
So was the Sea King the right aircraft for these first initial 2 weeks to do the job that you were intended to do?
In the first part of the Gulf, yeah. Yes, because of the long range. You could fill up a Sea King and you could fly for 6 hours if you wanted to. But it was always a trade-off with how much kit you were carrying. So you had to work out your how far you're going, to the weight of the kit you were taking, to actually do whether you could lift it off the deck. You could do a running takeoff, as we did do on the way down out to the Gulf. We had to pick up this large generator from, I think it was from Cyprus. It was a big, rather heavy generator, and we were told its weight, which is actually wrong. We subsequently found out, and we filled up enough fuel to head out towards the ship. And we tried to lift in the hover, but we couldn't get into the hover without over-torquing it. So we thought, well, we'll just taxi out to the runway, and so we did a running takeoff and managed to get airborne and headed out towards the ship. But meanwhile, the ship was sailing away from us down towards Port Said. And when you leave a ship on a helicopter and go off somewhere else, the ship tells you its speed and its track. And so you can then plot where it will be at a certain time. And so when you go away from the ship and do whatever you're doing, come back, it'll intercept where the ship is. And so we headed towards where we thought the ship was, and it wasn't there. In the middle of the Mediterranean, we think, okay. So we looked at the fuel, we thought, well, we can keep going for a while. We called up on guard and on 1215, which is the other emergency frequency, and the ship's frequency, and no one answered. And eventually we were getting to this stage where we need to divert back to Cyprus, and then we would then lose the ship because it was sailing at full speed to get out to the Gulf. So we thought, well, we'll try this plan B, which was use our HF. And we used to use Portishead Radio, which is an HF bunch down to Bristol. And you could do phone patches. You could call them up on HF, and you could tell them who to phone, and you could then speak to people on the HF. And it was another way of doing it, but it wasn't secure. But we thought we concluded that the only way we were going to find the ship was to do this. So we phoned up on HF, Portishead Radio in Bristol, from the Mediterranean, and we said, can you phone the Admiralty? We need to know where Fort Grange is, otherwise in the next less than half an hour, otherwise we will need to go back and they'll never get this generator thing. And they did. They gave us the ship's position, and we then headed off towards it, and we found it. So well done, Portishead Radio.
So then you went back, but then you were called up to rejoin the war, as it were. Could you tell us about this?
Yes, we went back in early December, and they reformed a new squadron, 848 Squadron, with various pilots from the training squadrons and other pilots from within the Navy, and we were another jungly squadron effectively. And we flew out in about the 2nd or 3rd of January 1991, and the aircraft had already been sent out by ship. And we met the aircraft in Gazelle port, where we then created this new squadron, 848. And so it was a good squadron, because there's a lot of chaps I knew from 846 who'd gone off to other squadrons who were drafted back in, and very experienced training chaps as well. And all the Sea Kings were all painted up in pink desert colours. And then we had 2 brand new ones, and I picked one up from the port, and it was like getting in, if you're lucky enough to buy a new car, it had that new car smell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was clean and there was no dust or shrapnel anywhere. And you jumped into this thing and thought, lovely. And I didn't get that one to use, but we did have our own aircraft effectively for the duration of the Gulf War. We were initially at Gazelle port for a bit, and then when the air war started on January 17th, we then headed into the desert, about 300 miles or so, up towards the Saudi and Iraq border, near King Khalid military city. And so we were near there with 845 Squadron, and the Puma Squadron boys were out there too. Our role was to support the 1st UK Armoured Division, so moving men and kit around for them, and we also had a second role of casualty evacuation, and we had an RAF medic corporal with us, and our chap was known as Maggot, but that's, I won't go into that detail again, but he was a lovely chap, and wherever we flew there was now 4 of us in the Sea King. We had all our gas mask kit, respirator, and our weapons, personal weapons, which is S80 and the 9mm handgun, and we also had a 66 rocket launcher, a grenade launcher, which was a marvellous thing. It was basically the thing you unfolded and then you fired off this grenade and then ran away bravely. Well, that was our plan anyway.
Each person had
No, we had one on the... That'd be quite nice. Yeah. No, we had one on the Sea King. So we were in the desert as a unit, and the junglies, as I said earlier, we were trained to do this. We were used to operating independently. When we landed, we had to dig our trenches so that we could protect ourselves for any incoming missiles or whatever. And that took a few days because it was almost solid rock. We were in a tent of either 8 or 10 of us. So the 4, myself and Roger Ramjet, my co-pilot, and crewman, and Maggot, our medical fellow, and some of the engineers. So we all lived together, again we just flew around the desert, supporting the army, and picking up any injured people as required. And again we using the NVG and our low-level flying to good use. We managed to work out that flying around at 50 feet with the radar altimeter hold in, which is normally used for flying over the sea with the radar altimeter hold. We could get down to 100 feet and then wind it down to 50 feet, and so you could whiz around in kind of formation with your night vision goggles on over the desert. Because it was so flat where we were, it was fine. Occasionally you'd set your warning bug to 10% below your height that you're cleared to fly low level. So you set it to about 40 feet or 35 or whatever, and occasionally you get the kind of beep if you'd gone too low, even though it was holding the height. You were going over a sand dune or something. But in the desert there wasn't much ambient light for the night vision goggles, so it was, they worked quite hard. But if you're information, then you just watched what the other chap was doing in front of you.
So how many Sea Kings were sent out and how many crews?
Well, there was 2 squadrons. There was 845 and 846, and I'm guessing now, I think we probably had about 8 or so aircraft each, if not more. Each helicopter had 2 pilots and a crewman, and then there were some spare who were working in the ops side, in the box bodies we call it, organising the tasking. And the squadron executives, so the boss and the senior pilot. So there was a good number of us, and we all said we were effectively in the desert in tents for almost 2.5 months. But you were kind of used to it because that's how we operated. So the training did work, because that's how we operated in the field, and so to do it for real we're kind of comfortable with it, even though the environment was a bit antisocial. It was kind of slightly natural to us in a way, so we were used to that sort of antisocial way to live.
How did the Sea Kings actually cope in this environment then?
Very well. We had the sand filters, which as long as we weren't flying in rain and switched them on, they were fine. And they would clear the sand away from the engines, and so you could sit in the hover quite comfortably and not damage the gnome engines. And for low level, as I said, using the radar altimeter hold worked very well for us. And the amount of people that we could carry and fly around for the tasking, it was good, and we had more than enough people out there to do the job, and we were never short, and we flew a lot, but it was just tasking as required until the actual ground war started. Then we just went into Iraq, and it was such a short ground war, fortunately, that by the time we were going into Iraq, we were picking up injured Iraqis or British soldiers and lots of POWs, and taking them back to the POW camps which had been set up in Saudi.
So, did the Sea King's range diminish in this new environment?
No, not really. We still had the range. We just had a wee bit more kit on board, but it doesn't really reduce how far we could go. We rarely did long 6-hour trips. That was really from kind of ship to ship sort of thing. But once in the desert, you're doing short hops, and you didn't use that side of the helicopter as much. But it was just used as purely as a trooping and a Casevac helicopter. We set up the back so we could have some stretchers. We had a stretcher fit, which was part of the Sea King fit, which you could put in, which we had. So we could put some. I think I picked up 3 injured Iraqi soldiers, and they were on stretchers. We took them back to a hospital. So we had that fit as well. So it was fairly a dynamic bit of kit, really, that you could do all sorts of things with it, and so it's quite flexible.
Is there any incidents or stories that stick out into your mind?
From the Gulf?
Yeah.
Well, from a flying point of view, we had this fun of going off low level, 50 feet, as I said, and you would set your height warner if you went too low, and we transitioned off in a formation, and I'd forgotten to set my warning system, and we were turning low level, and I think we must have been about 50 odd feet or so, and for whatever reason, I looked in to my left and to my right rather, and I was just distracted by something, and I glanced down at the radalt, and there it was going through 30 feet at quite a rate, and I just gave it a pull of the collective, and up she went, and so fortunately it had enough power to protect me from that one, but that was just classic human error, which we all do. Yeah. We also had a couple of Scud missile explosions going on above our heads. We were quite near King Khalid military city, so there was a target nearby, and quite a lot of Scuds would be firing over our heads down to other parts of Saudi, and so you get an air raid warning, and so you put on your gas mask and jump into your slit trench, which you'd dug, and you'd watch these things going over or see the trails. But then one day it was late in the evening, and I was wandering back to the tent, and there was this sudden explosion, and I looked up, glanced to my right, I ducked, and it was like a massive firework had gone off. And immediately put on my gas mask and ran into the tent, and everyone came scuttling out and jumped into their foxholes. And what had actually happened was there were some Scud missiles coming in, and our Patriot battery missile, the Americans, were not too far away, and they'd fired off 2 Patriot missiles, and 3 rather, and one had gone low level and come straight towards our camp, and it self-detonated just above our camp. It didn't damage any of our aircraft, but there's a few holes in some of the tents. It damaged, I think some of the Pumas were hit, but no one was injured. But that certainly, it was quite a firework display to watch, because we then sat there watching more of these going up, and luckily, and you see them going up, and it was kind of explosion as they took out the Scud. So they were accurate most of the time.
So how long did you spend over in the Gulf, and do you feel like yourself and the Sea King did a good job?
I was there really from August, and when it initially went out, apart from the wee gap in Christmas, until end of March. So yes, we did. The Sea King performed very well. Not only were we 848 in the desert and 845, but 846 Squadron, they were embarked on a ship. I think it was HMS Ocean. May be wrong on that one, but they were embarked on a ship for a similar sort of role, but to do assaults from the sea if need be. So there's actually 3 jungly squadrons out in the desert, or in the desert environment. So yes, the Sea King did well. There were no technical issues that stopped us operating. Just the usual challenge of working in a sandy and dusty environment for the engineers. And it wasn't always sunny and warm. In January, it was getting down to 0 and below in the tents, and we had frost in the mornings, and the poor engineers were out there in all conditions, and we had sandstorms coming in. So it was hard for them, and easy for us as we just stooged about in the aircraft. But we were out cleaning the aircraft with them and hoovering up as much of the sanding and helping where we could. But the engineers certainly had a hard time of it, I must say.
So after this, you went back to the RAF. Could you tell us about this?
Yes, I went back to RAF Royal Naval Air Station Culdrose, and interestingly, I had to do the full Sea King course because the Air Force were a bit confused about somebody coming in who had 1,000+ hours on Sea Kings, but I had to do the full ground school. I know, exactly. And then did the Search and Rescue SAR2 course, which was right and proper because I only had limited search and rescue experience. So I did that course down at Culdrose on the Mark III Sea King, which was effectively to fly exactly the same as a Mark IV, but it had the radome just behind the head. And so you had the radar in the cabin. So you had a radar operator who then became the winch man, and you had the crewman, the winchman who went down on the winch. So there's 4 of you. And the actual kit you had on board was pretty much the same VOR, ILS, and the TANS, the Tactical Air Navigation System, but it was obviously heavier aircraft because of the radar. And so we did a quick course there, and then I went to RAF Manston in Kent, and flew there. And the role was, a primary role actually, was to pick up fast jet pilots who were ejected as a primary role. So in theory, if you're going off to save somebody in a yacht or whatever, and you heard the personal locator beacon of a fast jet guy who's gone in, you had to kind of sneak to, terribly sorry, and head off and go and pick up the fast jet guy. That was the theory. You never got to that, and I never picked up any fast jet chaps because it was such a rare thing. So we were really aid to the civil powers and looking after those in our 200-mile circle around Manston. And the routine was very civilized compared to SH, support helicopter flying. It was known as the pipe and slipper world of search and rescue.
That's a great term.
Which was quite nice actually. And you effectively went into the squadron at we used at 9:30 and got a briefing from the other crew what they'd done and how the aircraft was. Took over the aircraft and went out and had a look around it and got all the switches in the way you liked them, in the correct position obviously. And you were then on standby to get airborne within 15 minutes during the day and 45 minutes at night. So you lived in the squadron for 24 hours. So we used to do 2 hours day flying and 2 hours night flying. And the day flying would be going off and hovering over the cliffs, doing cliff winching exercises, or going out in the channel. You'd fly out and you'd call up on channel 16, which is the maritime emergency channel everyone listened out to. And you'd come up to a ship, you'd get into the hover, and you call them up and say, maybe winch down our winchman for training, whatever country it was. And 99% of the time they say, yes, marvellous. And so you'd find a spot on the ship and winch them down onto the bridge or the deck or whatever was convenient. And the crewman would scuttle inside to the bridge and go and have a chat to the captain, and you would fly around the ship and then would pick them up. Or you'd put in a beacon on a wooden cross which would float in the water with a buoy on it, and that would be a training beacon on 243, 243.5, so that it wasn't the emergency frequency, it's just a wee bit off. And you then go off and do your cliff winching or boat winching, and then you'd home in to the beacon. And you had a set procedure which the Sea King had to be not designed for, but which we used, where you'd come along at 200 feet with the radar altimeter hold in, fly home in on the beacon, fly out straight over the beacon, so that's where the fast jet guy would be sitting in his dinghy, and then you'd do a teardrop maneuver, come round, and then you would press the thing called the transition down button, which would take you from 200 feet down to the 50-foot Doppler hover. And the Sea King would sit in any sea conditions, effectively, unless it was very antisocial, it would sit in that Doppler hover as long as it wanted, until you ran out of fuel. And because the distance where the door was in the Sea King and where I was sitting in the hover, I couldn't actually see the dinghy. So you'd come to the hover, and then when a chap was in his personal locator, the small dinghy, because I couldn't see them, I couldn't hover. So I would give the hovering of the airplane to the crewman, on this thing called the auxiliary hover trim, and this would give the crewman 8 knots of movement of the helicopter left, right, forward, or back. So he would have to multitask, and the winchman would be going down on the wire, and the radar operator would be the winch operator, and he'd be moving the winch up and down and flying the airplane to keep it over the dinghy. And it was very difficult because we used to occasionally have a go, and I was rubbish at it. But it was so the winchman, the winch operator had a very important role in that respect when it picked up down crew, because we couldn't see. And it's the same on smaller ships. Sometimes you had to give the hover to the or wee yachts. You had to give the hover to the winchman, or you'd be hovering over a cliff, and then or near the side of the cliff, and again the winchman would be giving you the patter and telling you how far away your blades were from the cliff. And there were different techniques of moving the winchman either over the cliff or from the bottom up or from the top down, and to kind of cliff walk his way down or cliff walk the way up, depending on the environment. And you were always trying to keep the winchman as safe as possible. Because every time you came to a situation, you would sit in the hover and discuss the plan. I would tell them how much power I had, right, we're single engine hover, that's fine if we were light or not. And then effectively the winch man and the winch operator would come up with how they were going to solve the problem, how they were going to land on the ship or on the yacht. And you would say, well, that's fine, that works, I can sit in this heading or that heading, and we've got an hour plus fuel, off you go. And you would do it as a complete team.
So it's not simply just get on that, go down.
No, no, indeed not. No, it was because every big ships are fine, but if it was a small yacht, then you had the mast and all the wires that attach the mast flailing all over the place, and they're rolling around. And so it was quite tricky. And so often on a yacht, you couldn't actually see parts of the yacht to hover on, and you couldn't use auxiliary hover trim just because of the sea state, or the Doppler would lock onto the radar would lock on, the Doppler hover would lock onto the actual boat. So you had to do it manually, and because you couldn't see what you're hovering on, you had to hover by attitude. So you look at the horizon, the crewman would give you forward one, forward right, and steady, and that's a steady hover. You then look at the attitude, and you'd use your horizon outside, or the actual artificial horizon on the instrument, as your hover reference, with a combined of looking out at the sea, and you get little bits of spume from waves, which sit in the same place for 5, 10, 20 seconds. So you can use that as your hover reference. So you had this kind of combination to actually maintain a steady hover. But the crewman you were allowed to kind of maneuver around until the actual pickup, and then he would try and get you as overhead as possible. Or you'd be slightly further away, so when he winched in, the winchman and the casualty would be pulled away from the heaving deck. So different ways of doing it, but you were a complete team. Yes, I was the captain of the aircraft, but I was in charge of their lives, or if they said no, we can't do this, then that was it.
There was no.
You correct, because you're not going to boot the rescuers in a dangerous position. You had to think of the team, but I never had that, fortunately.
Yeah. So how many rescues did you get under your belt, and did you enjoy this tour?
Number of rescues, I should have counted in my logbook. At least 100 or so.
Wow. Okay.
Because I did 2 tours, so I did 4+ years, and also some time down the Falklands. We used to go down there and support the army and do search and rescue down there. The rescue flights were varied from people in lilos being blown out to sea, to heart attacks on ships, to this one chap. We were called out to Beachy Head from Manston, and the call was somebody's gone over Beachy Head on a mountain bike. I thought, what? And he thought, well, he's history. And we got there, and he was just on the edge of Beachy Head, sheer cliff, and he'd gone over, and he was halfway down, and we picked him up. He'd broken his leg, so he was okay. Or 2 other ones where this canoeist was out and got lost in the River Medway, and was trying to get back ashore, and they found the canoe, but they didn't find the canoeist. And so we went searching with the MVG and all that sort of stuff. We did it for about a couple of hours. And they said, we found the canoe, but we haven't found him. And then we got a call from the search and rescue people saying, we've actually found him, you can stand down. So we're not needed, no, it's fine. So we headed back to Manchester and we called up and said, well, where was he? And he said, well, he was actually in hospital. I said, oh, that was lucky. It was, he managed to get in hospital, that's good. And he said, well, no, he got himself aground and walked away from his canoe. And as he was walking back to his house, he was knocked over by a car. So, but he was fine, but he was just, so he was in hospital, but not exactly as we envisaged.
Yeah, that must have been a bit confusing.
Yes, exactly. So other ones were people stuck in cliffs, and we did put down once put down the EOD team, the explosives team, onto a trawler because they'd picked up a mine from the Second World War, one of these round jobbers with the spikes sticking out. And we came to the hover and we could see this mine in the nets bashing against the side of this trawler. We thought, let's do this quickly. So we dropped the EOD team down and left them to do their work and ran away bravely. I think it's all the best way.
Yeah. Well, John, it sounds like you've had a really great career. So what aircraft did you enjoy flying the most?
Flying the most, I probably think the Wessex, just because it was your first tour and I'd worked so hard and waited so long to get to an operational tour, and the whole thing was great fun. I did enjoy the Sea King for the different roles that I did with it, doing SH flying and search and rescue. And I don't think you can use a helicopter for anything better than saving lives. So that was an honour to do that, and I enjoyed that. From a helicoptering point of view, that was it. From a fixed wing point of view, I did fly the Chipmunk flying cadets to build up more fixed wing hours before I came out of the Royal Air Force, and that was a joy. It was a lovely aircraft to fly, I must say. And taking wee cadets up, I think they're 11 or 12, the youngest, and they'd climb into the back of the Chipmunk with the engine running, and you'd look over your shoulder, and all you'd see this the top of the helmet. They were so small. You couldn't see them, and you'd say, have you flown before? Yes, sir, I have. And they said, what would you like to do today? Aerobatics, please, sir. And that's all they wanted to do.
Aerobatics.
It's great.
So, John, do you have any hobbies?
Yes, I play golf poorly, and I do quite a bit of road cycling and gardening, and I'm involved with my local church, so I do bits and bobs with that. That keeps me busy, and usual family stuff, although they're a bit older now, I must say.
So is there an aircraft or helicopter you wish you could have flown?
Oh, good question. I think probably the Huey, the classic Huey from the Vietnam War. It sounds great, and it looks a classic helicopter fly. And I've read a number of times that book Chicken Hawk, and if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. It's a great book, and what that chap did flying that the Huey around in Vietnam was quite impressive, I must say. I'd love to have a go in a Huey, I must say.
Yeah. So do you fly currently?
Yes, I work for EasyJet, flying the Airbus 319, 320 series aircraft, based up in Edinburgh, and I've been with them for the last 10 or so years. And before that, I worked for a BA subsidiary called BA Connect, and we were originally Manx Airlines, but then bought over by British Airways. And I flew the Jetstream 41 and the ATP and the Embraer 145. So yes, so still flying. It's a bit more civilized way to aviate rather than whizzing around low level, and I can cruise around over the Alps, drinking a cup of coffee, watching the world go by.
Lovely. And finally, do you ever get sick of talking about aviation?
No, no, I don't. I'm lucky I still enjoy it, and I've been very fortunate to have done what I've done with the military, and it's been great fun. And so if anybody does ask me, then I will probably bore them to tears, so I have to stop myself.
Well, John, thanks very much for being on the show.
My pleasure.